The evening air was thick with the scent of exhaust and the faint, lingering chill of autumn. Near the highway exit, 2 patrol cars were stationed beneath the amber glow of a single streetlight. Officer Jack Turner sat in the passenger seat of one, feeling the dull hum of the engine beneath him as he kept a watchful eye on the passing cars. Beside him was his partner, Officer Hank Wilson, a man whose eyes were as sharp and unyielding as the lines etched into his face. Jack was young, fresh out of the academy, and eager to prove himself. He had heard stories about Hank's reputation, stories of how years of patrolling this stretch of highway had hardened him, made him cautious, maybe even suspicious of anyone who didn't fit his narrow image of a good citizen. Jack wasn't sure if he admired that about Hank or if he was quietly wary of it. Tonight, as he sat beside his partner, he felt both a tinge of excitement and an underlying tension. Hank took a slow sip from his cooling coffee, his eyes scanning each car that passed. When he saw a sleek black van approaching, his gaze lingered, his eyes narrowing. "Pull him over," Hank muttered, barely glancing at Jack. "Something about that one doesn't look right to me." Jack turned his gaze to the van, which seemed to be moving at a perfectly normal speed. He hesitated but didn't argue. Hank was the senior officer here, and Jack didn't want to appear insubordinate. He flipped on the lights and signaled for the van to pull over, his heart pounding a little harder than he'd expected. As the van slowed to a stop, Jack felt the faintest ripple of uncertainty. Something about this didn't feel right. They hadn't clocked the driver speeding. There hadn't been any erratic driving. This was all based on a hunch, Hank's instinct, something he'd justified countless times in the past. But Jack couldn't shake the feeling that tonight might be different. The 2 officers exited their vehicle and approached the van, Hank taking the lead. When the driver's window rolled down, Jack's eyes met a calm, steady gaze. The man behind the wheel appeared composed, dressed in a tailored suit that seemed slightly out of place against the gritty backdrop of the highway. "Good evening, officers," the man said, his voice smooth, almost commanding. Hank's face remained unreadable, his eyes narrowed with suspicion. "License and registration, please," he demanded, his tone carrying a chill that even the evening air couldn't match. The man didn't hesitate, reaching into his glove compartment and retrieving the requested documents. He handed them over, and as Hank glanced at the ID, a flicker of recognition passed across his face. The name on the license, Thomas Lancer. Jack leaned in, peeking over Hank's shoulder to get a look. His eyes widened as he took in the name and title, Head of Internal Affairs at the Brimwood Police Department. The very person responsible for ensuring officers like Hank followed the rules. For a brief moment, the silence was thick, stretched taut between the 3 men. Jack's mind raced as he tried to process the situation. They'd just pulled over someone with the power to make or break officers' careers. Someone who likely had every rule, every protocol, and every possible regulation memorized. "Hank," Jack said quietly, glancing at his partner, "maybe we should let this one go." But Hank's jaw was set, his eyes locked onto Thomas Lancer's calm expression. He was never one to back down, not even when it came to someone with Lancer's influence. In fact, Jack suspected that Hank resented people like Lancer, the ones who held officers accountable, the ones who, in Hank's eyes, didn't understand what it was like to be on the ground, patrolling the streets, making split-second decisions. "Were you speeding, Mr. Lancer?" Hank asked, his voice low and biting. It wasn't a question so much as a challenge, a last-ditch attempt to assert some semblance of authority over a man who clearly had none of the usual reasons to be pulled over. Thomas's gaze was steady, unflinching. "I wasn't speeding, Officer Wilson," he replied evenly. "Is there a problem?" Jack could feel his stomach tighten. The tension was thick now, suffocating. He glanced between the 2 men, sensing that they were crossing into dangerous territory. He knew that technically, they were pushing the boundaries of protocol, perhaps even overstepping their authority. And yet, Hank's stubbornness was like an immovable wall. Hank didn't respond to Thomas's question. Instead, he spoke to Jack. His tone clipped. "We're doing a routine check. Let's make sure everything's in order." Jack hesitated, a lump forming in his throat. Routine check? This was anything but routine. He opened his mouth to speak, to suggest they move on. But the look in Hank's eyes silenced him. Reluctantly, he stepped back, allowing Hank to continue. Thomas, to his credit, remained calm. His gaze didn't waver. His expression didn't flinch. He merely observed, a silent witness to the lines they were crossing, the rules they were bending. Jack couldn't help but feel a growing sense of dread, a gnawing worry that they'd initiated something far more consequential than they realized. As Hank took his time inspecting the ID, Jack found himself wondering about the man in the van. This was a person who dealt with officers like Hank on a daily basis, a man whose job was to enforce accountability within the department. And here they were, putting that very principle to the test. When Hank finally handed back the ID, his face was unreadable, but his eyes betrayed a hint of irritation, a flicker of resentment. "Step out of the vehicle, Mr. Lancer," Hank said, his voice cold. Jack's heart dropped. This wasn't just a check anymore. This was something else entirely, a battle of wills, a test of dominance. And Jack was beginning to feel that they were on the losing side. Thomas Lancer stepped out of his sleek black van, his movements slow and deliberate, his gaze fixed on Officer Hank Wilson. The quiet authority he exuded seemed to sharpen the tension in the air, making Jack's pulse quicken as he watched. Standing tall in the dim glow of the highway lights, Thomas looked like he belonged to a world where men like Hank held no power. And yet, here he was, hands at his sides, allowing this unwarranted display of authority. Hank's mouth was a grim line, his eyes narrowing as he gave Thomas a once-over. The way he watched him was different now, more guarded, almost defensive. It was as if the weight of Thomas's title, head of internal affairs, had finally registered, but Hank's pride wouldn't let him back down. "Routine check." "Ha!" Thomas remarked, his tone calm, almost conversational. There was no edge in his voice, yet something about it made Jack tense up. He knew it was a simple comment, but it was clear Thomas was challenging the so-called routine nature of this stop. Hank ignored the comment and signaled to Jack. "Search the car," he muttered, keeping his eyes trained on Thomas. Jack's throat went dry. Hank," he whispered, stepping closer. "I think we've done enough here. He's clean." But Hank's jaw was set, his gaze hardening as he looked at Thomas. "We're not finished until I say so, Turner," he snapped, his voice low but filled with a barely contained defiance. Jack took a step back, feeling the invisible line they were crossing becoming a chasm. Thomas gave a faint nod, gesturing to the car. "By all means, officers. I've got nothing to hide." The calmness in his voice, his willingness to cooperate, everything about his demeanor made Jack uneasy. This wasn't a man who was used to being questioned, much less searched. And yet, here he was, allowing two officers to invade his privacy without a hint of resistance. As Jack moved toward the car, he glanced at Thomas, catching the faintest hint of a knowing look. It was as if Thomas was watching a scene unfold, a scene where he already knew the outcome. Jack swallowed hard, dreading what that outcome might be. Inside the car, everything was neatly arranged, documents stacked in the glove compartment, a briefcase in the back seat, and not a single item out of place. It was the kind of order that only someone meticulous and exacting could maintain. Jack knew he wouldn't find anything, and part of him wondered if Hank knew it too. But Hank seemed driven by something deeper now, something beyond protocol. Minutes passed, and with each second, Jack felt the weight of Thomas's presence pressing down on them. Hank's frustration was mounting. His face twisted with barely concealed irritation as he combed through the car, finding nothing that would justify the stop. With a huff, he slammed the passenger door closed, the sound echoing through the silence. "Finished!" Thomas's voice cut through the air. calm and unshaken, but there was a hint of steel beneath it now. Hank's nostrils flared, his pride bruised but not broken. Not quite. Open the trunk. Jack's heart sank. This was crossing the line, they both knew it. Thomas hadn't done anything to warrant this. But Hank was refusing to back down, refusing to accept that he'd been wrong. Hank, maybe that's enough, Jack murmured, hoping his voice sounded stronger than he felt. Hank ignored him, his gaze locked onto Thomas, who was watching him with an unreadable expression. With a slow, almost resigned movement, Thomas pressed a button on his keys, and the trunk popped open. Inside, there was nothing but a set of neatly organized tools, a sparetire, and a duffel bag. It was, like everything else in the car, a testament to Thomas's sense of order. Hank rifled through the trunk, his fingers tugging at the contents, his frustration reaching a boiling point as he found nothing. Yet again. But just as Hank leaned closer, his hand brushing against the duffel bag, he froze, his eyes catching a gleam of metal. Slowly, he backed away, staring as Thomas reached into his jacket and pulled out a badge, holding it up for both officers to see. The badge glinted under the dim streetlight, its significance impossible to ignore. "I think we're done here, officers," Thomas said, his voice firm, layered with a quiet authority that left no room for argument. Jack's stomach twisted. He felt the gravity of the situation settle over him, heavier than before. They hadn't just pulled over any civilian. They had tried to exert their authority over the man who upheld the very standards they were bound to follow. The man whose job it was to ensure that officers like them acted within the law. Hank's face hardened, but Jack could see the hint of doubt flickering in his eyes. He knew he'd overstepped. Even he couldn't deny the consequence of what they'd done. Thomas took a step forward, his gaze focused squarely on Hank. "Officer Wilson," he began, his tone icy yet composed. "Misuse of authority is not something I take lightly. I'll be filing a full report on this incident. Brimwood doesn't need officers who think they're above the law." Jack's mouth went dry, the impact of Thomas's words settling like a heavy stone in his gut. Hank stood frozen, his fists clenched, but he had no defense left. Thomas's badge, his title, it rendered any argument useless. Jack cleared his throat, desperation creeping into his voice as he stepped forward. "Mr. Lancer, please. We were just doing our job," he stammered, his tone pleading, hoping to salvage whatever he could from the situation. He shot Hank a nervous glance, seeing the strain in his partner's clenched jaw. Thomas regarded Jack with a faint, almost sympathetic smile. "Officer Turner, I can see you tried to do the right thing. I'll make sure that goes into the report." His gaze drifted back to Hank. "But as for Officer Wilson, well, that's another story." The weight of the words was like a hammer blow. Jack felt the ground shift beneath him, the divide between right and wrong now clear, stark, and impossible to ignore. He had tried to intervene, but Hank's stubbornness had drawn them both into something far beyond their control. Hank's shoulders slumped slightly, the bravado drained from his face. He muttered under his breath, a barely audible, "This is going to ruin me." Thomas watched him, his expression unreadable, before giving a final nod. "Next time, officers, think twice before you pull someone over without cause. Justice isn't about power. It's about truth, and it's what holds us all to account." With that, Thomas turned on his heel and walked back to his car, leaving Hank and Jack standing in the cold, heavy silence, a silence thick with the weight of their mistake. Jack watched as the taillights of Thomas's van disappeared into the distance, the glow fading like the last flicker of their confidence. It was only then that Jack understood the true lesson of the night. Authority wasn't a weapon. It was a responsibility, one that came with consequences if abused. And as he looked at Hank, he knew that this was a lesson neither of them would ever forget. The silence on the ride back to the station was a thick, oppressive weight, settling over the two officers like a storm cloud. Jack gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white, his mind replaying the night's events over and over. He had joined the force to make a difference, to serve with honor and integrity. But tonight had shattered his idealistic vision, replacing it with a harsh, uncomfortable truth. Beside him, Hank was slouched in the passenger seat, his gaze fixed on the darkness outside. His usual air of authority was gone, replaced by a quiet, simmering bitterness. Jack could see the tension in Hank's jaw, the way his fists clenched and unclenched on his lap. But Hank's frustration wasn't with himself. It was with Thomas Lancer, the man who had dared to hold him accountable. They reached the station, pulling into the parking lot, where the familiar neon lights cast a cold glow on the brick building. Jack cut the engine, the silence between them broken only by the ticking of the cooling car. He finally turned to Hank, feeling the weight of the words he'd been holding back since they'd left the highway. "Hank," he began, his voice hesitant. "You know that was way out of line. We didn't have any reason to pull him over. And when we found out who he was," he trailed off, hoping Hank would acknowledge it, would show a sliver of regret or self-reflection. But Hank's face hardened, his eyes narrowing as he looked back at Jack. "You think I care who he is?" he spat, his voice low and defensive. "I don't answer to men like him. They sit in their cushy offices, passing judgment on what we do out here. They don't understand what it's like to be on the front line, dealing with people who'd throw us under the bus in a heartbeat." Jack stared at him, trying to find the words to bridge the gap between them. But the distance felt insurmountable. Hank's words, his unwavering refusal to admit fault, struck a chord in Jack that was more unsettling than anything he'd felt that night. It wasn't just stubbornness, it was an ingrained, bitter defiance, a conviction that he was untouchable. "Hank, we have a responsibility," Jack said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Authority, it's not about power. It's about serving people, not lording over them." Hank scoffed, shaking his head. "Spare me the speech, kid. You've got a lot to learn if you think that's how the world works." He pushed the car door open, stepping out into the cool night air. "People like Lancer, they come and go. But out here, on the streets, that's where the real work is done. And sometimes that means doing things their rules don't cover." As Hank walked off toward the station entrance, Jack stayed behind, sitting in the driver's seat, feeling a pang of disillusionment sink deep into his chest. Hank's words echoed in his mind, twisting and tangling with his own thoughts. He had looked up to Hank, respected his experience and his knowledge, but tonight had peeled back a layer Jack hadn't seen before, a layer that revealed a man who had allowed authority to warp into entitlement. After a few minutes, Jack finally stepped out of the car, his footsteps slow and heavy as he made his way inside. The station was quiet. The late shift officers either hunched over paperwork or watching the clock, waiting for dawn. Jack's eyes scanned the familiar faces, wondering how many of them had stories similar to Hank's, wondering if this culture of unchallenged authority was more widespread than he'd realized. He made his way to his desk, settling into the uncomfortable chair, his mind racing with the weight of what had happened. He had a decision to make. He could let this night go, chalk it up to Hank's experience and the tough realities of their job, or he could confront it, bring to light what he'd witnessed. As he wrestled with his thoughts, he felt a presence beside him. He looked up to see Captain Barnes, a tall, imposing figure with eyes that seemed to miss nothing. Barnes was known for his unwavering commitment to justice, and Jack suddenly felt his heart hammer with the realization that the captain might already know something was amiss. "Turner," Barnes said, his voice a deep rumble, "I hear you and Wilson had an eventful night." The captain's gaze was sharp, scrutinizing, as if he could see straight through the rookie's carefully guarded expression. Jack swallowed hard, feeling his pulse quicken. "Yes, sir," he replied, trying to keep his voice steady. Barnes leaned in, his eyes narrowing slightly. "I'm going to ask you once, Turner. Did anything happen out there that I need to know about?" Jack's mind raced, Images of the night flashing before him, Hank's stubborn defiance, Thomas's quiet authority, the badge glinting under the streetlight. He knew that telling the truth could mean serious consequences for Hank. But he also knew that staying silent would make him complicit. He would become part of the same system he'd once believed was there to serve and protect. After a long, agonizing pause, Jack took a deep breath, the words spilling out before he could stop them. "Sir, Officer Wilson." He crossed a line. Captain Barnes didn't flinch, but his expression grew harder, colder. As he listened, Jack felt a strange sense of relief mixed with dread as he continued, recounting the events of the night in detail. When he finished, Barnes was silent, his gaze fixed on Jack with a piercing intensity. "Thank you, Turner," Barnes said finally, his voice carrying a weight that made Jack's chest tighten. "I'll handle it from here." Jack nodded, the reality of what he'd done settling over him. He knew he'd just thrown a wrench into the unspoken code of loyalty between officers, but he also knew it was the right thing to do. He watched as Captain Barnes turned and disappeared down the hallway, likely heading to Hank's office to deliver the news that would change his career forever. As the station's fluorescent lights hummed softly around him, Jack felt a strange mixture of relief and sorrow. He had taken a stand, upheld the values he believed in, but at the cost of a bond he'd once thought unbreakable. The lesson he'd learned tonight was one he would carry with him forever. Authority wasn't about wielding power. It was about wielding responsibility with integrity. And as he looked around at his fellow officers, he knew he'd spend his career trying to live up to the standard that Thomas Lancer had embodied.